Let's talk about trauma bonds, because I hear a lot of other coaches and therapists talk about this, and I swear I leave every video more confused than when I started. So in this video, I want to define trauma bonds, what they are, what they might look like, why they come about, how we get so stuck in them, and then what to do about it if you think you might be in one. Welcome to the channel. If you've been here before, welcome back. Let's dive straight in with the definition of trauma bonds. To define trauma bonds, we need to define trauma. So what is trauma? Okay, all human beings have needs. You can think of these needs like buckets. We have a bucket for safety and security. We have a bucket to feel heard and understood. We have a bucket for love and connection, freedom and autonomy, excitement and joy, importance, validation, and power and control. Those are basically the 7 human emotional needs. 7 buckets that our brain tries to fill for us at all times. Remember, our brain is a long, multi-million year survival machine. It is always finding problems so that it can solve, it is always working to solve problems it finds in the environment, because the world has been such a threatening place to us for so many millions of years. It's always looking either how do I fill up my buckets more, as in how do I create more safety, more security, more love, more autonomy, how do I get all these buckets filled, or even if they're already full, how do I prevent them from being emptied? So our brain is always working to help get our buckets full. Now, if our buckets are full, we're going to experience a lot of joy. We're basically going to feel like we are doing well as a human being. If our buckets are not full, our brain is going to kick in more and more to help fill them up. The emptier the bucket is, the more our brain's going to whir to get that bucket full. Now, finally, if our brain cannot figure out a way to get the bucket more full than what it is, we will enter a depression. Basically, we will acclimatize to where the bucket is and accept that that is our reality. So again, ideally the bucket is full. If the buckets start to empty, our brain will turn on trying to figure out, how can I receive more love? How can I have more power over my life? How can I be more understood? So our brain will try to help us fill the bucket. And then if it can't be filled, we acclimatize to the lower level of the bucket, but we will do so as less of a human. We will have lower energy. We will experience less joy. The lower all our buckets are, if we acclimatize and give up, we basically get depressed. That's what depression is. It's all our buckets going very, very low. So how is this relevant to trauma? Well, trauma is the experience of our buckets getting tipped out or holes busted in them in a way that we can't fully process at the time. In other words, let's take safety and security, because that's a relatively simple need to think about. If our safety gets threatened in the moment, or if we go through an event that we survive but which makes us feel very, very unsafe in the moment, then we will not be able to process all of the emotion and all of the pain of that bucket getting tipped out at the time. Instead, the remaining emotion will be buried as trauma, and that trauma helps us remember the experience so that we avoid it in the future. So it does depend on the capacity of the person whether or not something is traumatic. We hear people throw around the word trauma ridiculously in this society now. So traumatic that my bus was late. It's so traumatic that I couldn't get the dessert I wanted. Okay, that is not trauma. That is a joke of a word, and really it's a deep misuse of the term. Trauma is when the pain of having your bucket tipped out is actually beyond the capacity of your system at the time. So imagine you're at the zoo and you walk past a tiger cage and the tiger launches at the glass and bang, it hits the glass right next to you. You would get a hell of a fright, but you wouldn't call it trauma. Trauma would be the tiger escapes the cage, jumps on you, and takes a nibble out of your shoulder before someone pulls it off. That's trauma. That's more than your system would be able to process at the time. And I guarantee, if the tiger jumps on the glass, you might take a little bit of a wide berth because you had a fright. But if a tiger actually did that to you, you'd never go near another zoo again. Your body remembers when there is pain that it can't capacitate for at the time to prevent such a serious incident occurring again. Now, what's also important about this is that it depends on the capacity of the system. Because a child has very low capacity, especially a baby, what's traumatic to a child or baby would not inflict anything on a healthy adult. Imagine if a fully healthy adult has been brought up, had a very secure attachment style, great parenting, and then one day mum is pissed off and says, "I hate you." After 30 years of good, that's not going to cause trauma. But if a parent says that to a baby or to a young child, that's going to have a markedly different effect because it creates such a lack of safety in the child. The child has no capacity to really feel into that pain and no escape from it, so they're going to store it as trauma. So to understand trauma bonding, we need to understand trauma. It's the pain of the bucket being tipped out at a capacity that the system cannot process at the time. So bond. A bond can be a chemical bond. A bond can be a magnetic bond. In this case, we're talking about a person-to-person bond, a romantic bond. A bond literally bonds two people together. It sticks them. And the stickiest thing that bonds two people together is a particular drug called dopamine. You've probably heard of it. It comes from poker machines, sex, porn, basically anything that gives you status or distraction or short-term pleasure. Dopamine is the drug for it, sugary foods, etc. Now, dopamine has a very interesting function in the body because dopamine is our body's way of saying go towards something, go hard, go fast, don't even think about it. This is why it's associated with addictions. Dopamine also compels us into love. At the start of relationships, dopamine is running high for our new lover and we are obsessed with that person. We want to be with them. They are all we can think about. They are our focus. So dopamine becomes a big part of the bond. So for now, the first thing I need you to understand is trauma bonding is a bond, as in a connection with a romantic partner, or it could be a friend, but let's talk romance here. It is a bond that consistently causes trauma. As in being with the person makes your buckets holy. Some of the safety gets tipped out. You stop feeling important. And worse, you might acclimatize to the new level where the buckets are at. So you used to feel 90% safe and secure in your average life, and then you bond with this person who causes trauma, and now the trauma day after day puts your bucket down 1% each day, and pretty soon you're at 40% bucket instead of 90%. You start to acclimatize to this, and this is what we call toxicity, because you get a new level that's lower than the old one, but you're so bonded to the person that you can't escape it. So why do trauma bonds happen? I spoke about dopamine. So let me go through a few examples of why we get so bonded to people that can tip out our buckets and actually be really bad for us. Well, the first and most common thing I see with trauma bonding is the oscillation between good and bad. Now, often it's not actually good and bad. Often it's okay and terrible, or not so bad and horrible. When you're in a relationship where your safety is constantly threatened in one way or another, it could be emotional safety, physical safety, your confidence is slowly being undermined by the relationship, all you're craving is a good day. Or maybe just a day where you're not insulted. Maybe a day where things are just okay. So you're sitting there on these bad days where your bucket's being emptied, hoping that you can just have a good day, but your good day now is still nowhere near as good as your good day before you're with the person. It's like your bucket's dropped to 40% and you're hoping for a 60% day when you're an 80% before you're even in the relationship. So your brain is sitting there obsessing over, how do I get a 60% day? How do I get a day where I'm not insulted? How do I get a day where the person shows some level of care for me? We just want something that's a little bit better than what it is right in front of us. So that addiction, kind of like playing a poker machine, you're just hoping for that one day where you win a little bit of money. You're already down, okay, but at this point, you're just hoping to make a little bit back. That addiction with the dopamine keeps you in. And so ironically, unfortunately, the bucket falls to 50% over little by little, and then you're hoping to get it to 60. And you're just, if I could just get it to 60 today. And then the bucket goes 49, 48, 47, gets down to 40. And now you're going, I hope I can get it to 50. It's getting worse. But because you're feeling more and more unstable, it becomes harder and harder progressively to leave. And you get more and more addicted to just getting a little bit better than what it was. So that's one type of trauma bond. The second type of trauma bond I want to talk about is the wound mate trauma bond. So with a lot of these bonds, dopamine binds you so strongly that you're not able to get out, at least until you've got awareness around what's going on and take decisive action to do so. A wound mate is someone who's basically had the same wounds as you. They're a wound mate. And so what often happens with a wound mate is you meet someone and you realize this person has a very similar history to you, something in their childhood, often similar trauma in their childhood or similar events in their childhood make you feel understood like no one ever before. What's actually happened here, and when I do inner child work and deep healing, what we see is that one of the biggest things children need to resolve trauma is they need the capacity of the parent. Children can actually go through some pretty heavy stuff if they have a parent that they can process the emotion afterwards with. If a child can feel heard and held for what they went through, they can actually release a hell of a lot of emotion, but they need the help of the parent to do that. If the parent can do that, it doesn't get stored as trauma, or at least significantly less so. But if the parent is not there, not only does it get stored as trauma, the original event, but now the child also doesn't feel heard and understood. So there's a second additional trauma that's even worse for the child that they have to hold within their body. The world doesn't get me. I'm alone. Not even my own mother and father understand what I went through. And so there's this chronic, long-term, deep wound of feeling misunderstood, misheard, and like you are completely alone. And then someone comes in, a wound mate comes in, and this person just happens to have almost the same life story as you. Close-ish, similar trauma. But you meet this person, and suddenly the pain of not feeling understood, the long-buried hardship that your system can't process of no one gets me, I'm alone, it all disappears in an instant. All that buried pain, it's like a vent. It just like vents out and it's all gone. All the pressure of keeping that pain down disappears out into the universe. You've got this person who just healed your core wound. And your brain goes, oh my God, this is the best feeling I've ever felt. Dopamine, 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 dopamine. For a while, it's really good. You're just high as a kite in this relationship because you finally found someone who really gets you, who really understands you, who went through something similar to you and who knows what it's like. But unfortunately, going through the same trauma doesn't necessarily mean you have any relationship skills. It might make you feel very heard and understood, but what about all the other needs? Your body gets so addicted to that dopamine from feeling heard and understood that we forget about feeling safe. We forget about feeling powerful and like we have a sense of control. We don't get validated in the relationship. The dopamine gets so focused on keeping that person and keeping that feeling of understood, it does not want that loneliness to come back, that no one gets me. It's been buried there for so many years that when this person walks into your life, the last thing you want to do is get rid of them. Because otherwise you've got to bury all that stuff again in a much shorter period of time. So the dopamine gets us so focused on that person that we will basically stay in that relationship, as in stay bonded to that person, come hell or high water for our other needs. We barely even notice how much less safe we're feeling. We barely even notice that we can't set boundaries and are losing all our autonomy. The only need that matters is the one that we didn't have when we were a child. And because our brain gets focused on that, it becomes a trauma bond. We stay bonded and it causes all the other needs to go unmet and we become more traumatized from that. Another example of this along similar lines is the good old terrible twin flame bond. This is another type of trauma bond where basically someone shows you a part of yourself or helps you uncover a part of yourself that you weren't even aware you had lost until you met them. So this is not necessarily they understand you, as in the wound mate example. This is more like suddenly around this person, I have permission to be myself. Suddenly, this is the first person I've ever met where I can suddenly bring out all these parts of myself. I can suddenly show joy. I can suddenly dance. I can suddenly connect to XYZ part of myself. It's a little bit like, imagine if you bought a house and it was a brilliant house on paper. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a games room, all this good stuff. And you're really excited for it. And then you get to the house and there's only 2 bedrooms. There's only 1 bathroom. There's no games room. It's still the same house. You kind of recognize her in the photos, but you're like, and you're just sitting there doubting yourself thinking, I swear there was more to this house, but I guess not. And so you live on it. You get on with your life and you live in it for 10, 20 years, maybe more. And then one day, just by almost sheer coincidence, someone walks in and they're like, hey, what about the second level? And you go, what? Yeah, what about the second level? Second level looks great. And they walk over to your house in the middle of it. They punch a code in on the wall and the second story opens up. You knew it was there the whole time. There's a feeling of almost righteousness that like, I knew it. I bloody knew it. I had these different rooms. I knew what I bought. I knew they were there. I've spent 20 years with this kind of thing digging at me that I had other rooms in my house. And you, sir, have finally given me permission to see that. Imagine how enamored you're going to be by that person. Imagine how addicted your brain is going to get to that person. And imagine trying to set boundaries with this person. Imagine kicking them out of the house and letting them go. No way in hell your system's going to want you to do that. The dopamine and excitement of rediscovering those parts of yourself, parts of your house in this metaphor, is going to mean that you don't want to get rid of them at any cost. You might speak to your boundaries, but you're never really going to action on them. You're never really going to get rid of that person. And so you can never really build a healthy relationship with boundaries that you can't actually action on. There's another example of trauma bond. Often we lose parts of ourselves growing up. And then suddenly we just meet someone who happens to give us permission. Not that they necessarily even said anything. They just match an energy from our prior life in some way, shape, or form from our younger life. And all of a sudden, we feel like we have full permission around them to express that part of ourselves. The problem is not that the person helped you express yourself. The problem is you depend on them for it. You can't access that part of yourself on your own. They entered the password on the keypad, but they never told you what it was, and you never did the work to find it out for yourself. This will make the person intensely addictive. This will make that dopamine fire. And as I said, it makes them impossible to let go of. If your system has spent 20 years trying to stay blind to the fact that there are other parts of you and just kind of ignore it and pretend they're not there, then once you are shown those parts and once those parts are reinvigorated, it is going to feel like absolute hell to go back and turn them off. Basically, to go back to what you knew, have that person leave your life and pretend that the second level doesn't exist again. You could sort of pretend for a while because it came from when you were a kid, but now the person has actually lit up those parts. It's going to be so hard to bury those again. The real work here is in figuring out, as I say, how to access them for yourself. But this is why it's a trauma bond, because all the other relationship skills, all the other important things, they're all going to fall by the wayside, boundaries included. But you get so bonded to the fact that that person uncovered a part of yourself that you don't know how to access for yourself, it will be impossible to leave them. And therefore it's impossible to set boundaries and do other things. You have the difficult conversations, do the things you need to do in the relationship. And one final type of trauma bond I think is worth talking about, a bit more common, is codependence, as in your partner starting to depend on you for things they should be doing for themselves. It's one thing to do your partner's washing, but if you're doing your partner's washing every day to the point where they forget how to do it, that is a problem. That is codependence. But washing is not the biggest issue here. I'm talking about solving their self-esteem issues. I'm talking about solving their alcoholism. I'm talking about solving their work problems, taking responsibility for shit that is theirs. Makes you feel good because usually he, the person, we're assuming a man here, is very appreciative. Usually he says, babe, you're the best, you're amazing, you get that nice little hit of dopamine. But unfortunately, you are disempowering him by overstepping into his zones, his boundaries, and doing the stuff for him. It's traumatic to him because he becomes disempowered. He becomes less powerful by being with you. And it's traumatic to you because you're avoiding the parts of yourself that you're not wanting to face by solving his problems instead of focusing on your own. So you become bonded because you need each other. Again, there's that bond, that dopamine reward, but you are harming each other, as in your ability to meet your needs is decreasing. In the codependent example, the ability to be in control of your life, have power, feel powerful, a man is going to reduce that, and that's why it's traumatic, if he's with a codependent woman. If she's hiding all the alcohol bottles, he's going to be denied the consequences of his actions. That's going to give him less control over his life. That's going to disempower him. So hopefully you can see trauma bonds are created when two people come together and get addicted to each other, usually by dopamine, in a way where they are stuck, unable to actually fulfill the needs of each other in a way that grows their buckets rather than shrinks them. Ideally, a relationship should fill your buckets up. You should come out as more of a good person, more of a human, more growth, more challenged, more capable because of your relationship. But often what happens is we get stuck to someone who pokes holes in the buckets. And if that is you, that is essentially a trauma bond. You need to make sure you're aware of this, and you need to start being honest with yourself about whether or not this is your situation. Once you have that awareness, there are things you can do about it. You can have the difficult conversations. If you're codependent, you can start setting better boundaries. If you're addicted to a part of yourself that he's found, go find that part of yourself on your own. If you just want the mutual understanding from trauma, see if you can set boundaries with it. But trauma bonding is very dangerous because at the end of the day, it acclimatizes you to a lower bar with your buckets than you would have been if you'd not been with the person. So if you ever find yourself going, wait a minute, I was a happier, healthier, more well-rounded person when I wasn't in this relationship, you must ask yourself, is this a relationship you should really be continuing? I hope that helps you understand trauma bonds. If you want more details, or if you want to work on this yourself, or if you want to take advantage of my no man, no fee guarantee, you can book a call. The link is in the description. Otherwise, hit the big red subscribe button with the little bell, give the video a thumbs up, and leave a comment. And I will see you in the next one very soon.